Radio Yes Cymru.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Radio Yes Cymru, the podcast which is on your usual podcast apps and also on the Yes Cymru YouTube channel. My guest today is the artist and art historian Peter Lord, and he's curated an absolutely fantastic exhibition at the National Library of Wales here in Aberystwyth, which you should see, but it finishes on 6th of September, so get your skates on. Peter, the exhibition is called No Welsh Art. You're coming to us from a rather unartistic background office, if I may say so. You can see this on the channel. But if you tell us quickly what the exhibition is and what it's about.
Well, the exhibition is the first survey exhibition of Welsh visual culture since 1964, in fact, as far as I can see, and a very different one, obviously, to what would have been presented back then. It consists of about 250 works of different sorts, mainly paintings, but drawings and prints as well. 150 of them are from my own collection, and 100 of them are from the National Library collection. So it's just those two collections coming together. And from my point of view, of course, that was very interesting because the pictures were normally hanging in my house or stored in my house, and to see them transferred into a different context was personally very interesting for me. And of course, it filled out a lot of spaces within my own collection. So it's not as comprehensive as it could be because we've only used those two collections. And there are many pictures it would have been nice to use from, say, the National Museum collection and other private collections. But anyway, we've got these two things coming together. Now, it's called No Welsh Art, which might seem to be a peculiar way to start. But the reason is that we started with a quotation, which was from an essay written in 1950, 1951, and published in Wales, in which the author said, talking about the history of art in Wales, no patron, no critic, therefore no painter, no sculptor, no Welsh art. It is as simple as that. Now, if that had been Joe Bloggs saying that, perhaps we wouldn't worry too much. But in fact, the statement came from the chair of the Welsh Committee of the Arts Council of Great Britain. So it was an authoritative voice, and it proved to be an extremely influential voice. And to some extent, the articles repeating it received wisdoms because I can quote you things right back into the 19th century, which basically saying the same thing. Perhaps the most significant thing from my point of view about the statement was who made it. Because it was made by Dr. Llewellyn Wyn Griffith, a Welsh-speaking Welsh person who'd grown up in Blaenau Ffestiniog and in Dolgellau, but had migrated to London and become very much engaged with the English establishment, British establishment, if you like, comes to the same thing in London, really. And he was repeating what to my mind is a colonialized mentality, a colonialized attitude to his own culture. Unfortunately, it was extremely influential because it wasn't just him. He was part of a circle of Welsh and largely Welsh-speaking individuals in London who were involved in the arts from the establishment of the Arts Council in 1946. I'd pick out two of them who are of particular interest. One of that circle was a chap called Hugh Weldon, which, if you're of my generation, which will mean something to you, might not mean very much to younger generation. But Hugh Weldon, from Bangor originally, a Welsh speaker again, became an absolutely central part of the English establishment because he became the head of the BBC for 10 years.
Yes.
You can't get much more central than that.
No.
And he was, in fact, the man who commissioned a very famous series of programs about visual art made by Kenneth Clark, the art historian Kenneth Clark, called Civilization, which were very, very influential. But his first job before he became head of the BBC was, in fact, he was the first executive officer of the Welsh Committee of the Arts Council based in Cardiff. So he only stayed for 3 years, I might say, because his father, Sir Wyn Weldon, also a very important figure in the establishment in London and in the Welsh establishment in London as well, very prominent in the Cymrodorion and so on. His father had become involved with the Festival of Britain, and Wyn Weldon called his son back to assist in the disbursement of the monies in the Festival of Britain. So we got figures here who are very centrally placed in the establishment in the period. Another one of them is David Bell. David Bell was the first art officer of the Arts Council, again appointed in 1946. A lot of this goes back to the establishment of the Arts Council and attitudes prevailing at that time.
Yeah.
And David Bell, son of Sir Idris Bell, another prominent London Welsh figure, he would write in 1957 the first book about the first attempt to write a narrative history of Welsh visual culture, which was significantly called The Artist in Wales.
Yes.
And which he starts off by saying, famously, I've quoted this many times, I'm sure some of the people who are listening to this will have heard me quote it before, is on the first part of the book, he says, at no time since the Norman conquest, at any rate, has the Welshman had any visual artistic tradition, which is a very strange way to start writing a book about something, to deny its existence. Yes. And of course, what he wrote about was essentially, with a few exceptions, essentially he wrote about English artists who come to work in Wales, mainly in the landscape tradition. So, you got this whole block of people with colonialized mentalities, basically.
Yeah, so you have this sort of Dick Sean David kind of mentality. The Welshman done good. He wants to ingratiate himself in the English stroke British establishment, the same thing. One way is to denigrate, but also in the same way celebrate Welsh if it's not too Welsh, of course. Yeah. But it's also I think it'd be fair to say this is also it's some kind of a truism, or seen as a truism, a trope within Welsh speaking culture, that the Welsh is very good at poetry and music, but we're not very visual, and people are sort of taking this on, which is against all the evidence which people have seen, especially in the last few decades, from what I can see. This is still in, and also all the excellent work, or the important work, certainly the Eisteddfod has done for decades in trying to promote some kind of Welsh art, or a space for Welsh artists. So I think you wrote a very influential pamphlet, for me in any case, called The Aesthetics of Relevance. Rather difficult to say, Peter Lord, but Aesthetics of Relevance, published around 1989, 1990, something like that.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, your critique was that we need to look at Welsh art through Welsh eyes. And it's not necessarily going to be the same as, what you get in Venice or the Lowlands in the 16th century or something. We have to look at how it relates to our culture and expresses our identity, and then things become a bit clearer and interesting, and then there's stuff to look at and to discuss on our own merits and within our own merits and culture, not just another person's pair of glasses. So in this exhibition, I presume you're trying to get Welsh eyes to start off saying there is such a thing as Welsh art, and not just art in Wales, but it's something of Wales, of this land. What I find, and I'd like to discuss this with you, but what we found peculiar in the exhibition, which people should go and see, and I'm sure you're up for guided tours as well, is we have a lot of paintings which are of the land by Welsh people trying to make sense of their country or their identity in some way. There's also a lot of stuff, sometimes by Welsh people, which are using the old tropes about Wales and Welshness. So there's a peculiar mix there, isn't it, of people who are trying to say, like, we need to fight for something, we have something to celebrate. Famous painting of, I think, Caridwen, is it, coming from the ashes type of thing, a phoenix expression. But other things which are cartoons, of Welshmen going to London on the back of a goat with a big leak in his lapel. Can we just start maybe with what you found curating the exhibition? And it's a big exhibition, people, so there's a lot of stuff to see. Curating the exhibition, what were the common tropes you found about the Welsh? Maybe there's ones which definitely make you a Yes Cymru supporter after watching. And maybe the ones after, how you also collected paintings of Welsh people trying to make sense and try to fight against maybe some of these tropes. So we'll start with the tropey ones, the anti-Welsh tropes. What are the tropes which come up time after time, and are they still ongoing today?
Well, look, the methodology was for the exhibition was, as you rightly pointed out, to try and see things from the inside rather than look from the outside. What I would say before we discuss particular tropes is that the exhibition, in a way, isn't an art exhibition. with a
Right.
capital A. I've often said that actually, although I'm an art historian, I'm not particularly interested in art. What I am interested in, I'm very interested in what art does,
Yes.
what it affects, how it affects, and art does, broadly speaking, two things. I mean, I think it memorializes, it reflects the evolution of a culture, and it also sometimes, of course, has an influence on the culture as well, through artists making explicitly political pieces of art. So it does those two things. And this is an exhibition which tries to show what Welsh people saw from, in fact, the very early 18th century onwards, from the inside, how people actually essentially visualized themselves, and what they commissioned. So, and the way I've done it is to follow the analysis, if we can dignify it with that expression, of Wyn Griffith's No Welsh Art essay. So we start with looking at the gentry, for instance, as patrons, and then we look at the middle class as patrons, and then we look at the common people, Awyren bobl, as patrons, and we look at the allegation that there was no Welsh art criticism or art history written, which is again nonsense, and you can trace it right back to 1848, first substantial articles about visual culture written and published in the Welsh language in that year, very substantial pieces. And then we look at the actual product. And the way I've divided the product is to look at different kinds of Welsh identities. Okay, so you get different tropes appearing in different parts of those identities.
Right.
So, for instance, just to give a very obvious example, if you come from the valleys, the likelihood is you're going to identify with industrial society, within the culture of industrial society. If you come from maybe somewhere, I don't know, Dolgellau or somewhere like that, you might identify strongly with Welsh nonconformity. If you come from a chapel background, that may be a main focus, and that has its own tropes. For instance, I suppose in a way you could say there were tropes, but I mean, if you look at the gentry, for instance, so there's a lot of very familiar imaging there. The gentry expressing themselves through portraiture, and one of the things I've done there is to look at a very, if you like, bog standard gentry portrait, which is by Gainsborough, Thomas Gainsborough. Okay, very famous English artist, top-notch English artist. Okay, so Robert Wynne of Gorllewin takes himself off to Bath, gets himself painted by this famous English painter, comes back and hangs it on his wall. And there are dozens and dozens of portraits like that. The Welsh gentry, that was their standard way of representing themselves. But it's very interesting because what gets missed in that, these are very familiar pictures. You go to the National Museum, you could see lots of them hanging on the wall, you know. But what I know is that there was another side, for instance, even to Robert Wynne in particular, to his patronage, which is that he patronized a local artisan painting workshop as well. So we have in there a picture that he commissioned to celebrate the coming of age of his son. And it's a very simple picture. It's a workshop picture, and it would have only been hung up for a day or two, perhaps at a ball or a feast or something like that, to celebrate in 1787 the coming of age of his son. But that kind of patronage has got completely missed out. And in fact, it's interesting because those kinds of pictures are rare as hen's teeth. You know, Thomas Gainsborough portraits, incredibly, you know, to a penny, except that they're 2 or 20,000 quid, you know. But pictures like the one I'm describing now, the coming of age picture, they're incredibly rare because they were ephemera. They didn't survive. They were part of the visual world of the gentry. And right next to them is a whole group of pictures which you never see, but which were terribly important to the gentry, which are pictures which document from the inside the way of life. They're pictures of especially hunting, for instance, horses, dogs, all that way of life. So we've got a group of pictures from Gogerddon, which is a house near Aberystwyth, which are not great art, you know, they're not high art, they're not even academic art, but they're very much reflections of how the gentry saw themselves. And you could say that those hunting themes, because, you know, there are dozens of prints of hunting and so on and so forth produced, and those are kinds of tropes of a kind of Welshness. Of course, it's a kind of Welshness which was very like Englishness in the period as well. But you've got to remember that there was this other aspect. I mean, on the coming of age picture, for instance, there's a unique englyn. It's in Welsh.
Englyn. All right.
Yeah.
So four-line strict meets of poetry.
Yeah, absolutely. You know,
in Welsh.
And that's not something we associate with the gentry. but it's there.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then, further on, I mean, obviously, for instance, when we're looking at industrial society, there are lots of pictures of coal mining. It's some of the most powerful images, in fact, in the exhibition, because they come from the 1920s and the 30s, the Depression. Incredibly powerful pictures.
Yeah.
And you could call them tropes. Yeah, okay, coal miners, black faces, all the rest of it. But they're not, because they're actually, a lot of them are coming from inside, because three of the most important painters came from inside that industrial community. And in fact, two of them, Archie Griffiths and Vincent Evans, they had worked underground.
Yes.
So you can call them tropes, but they're not really. They're documents which come from the inside of a terrible experience of the Depression, and working and then not working because of the unemployment on the inside. On the other hand, you've got outsider views. So there's a section which I've included on how the English portrayed us as Welsh people, and you referred to poor Taff riding on his goat to London, which we smile at. But in fact, if you read the text with these, because there's image and text on prints from about 1750, I mean, they're absolutely racist. I mean, they're not amusing. They are nasty, racist images. It shows how Welsh people were being othered in that period, and othered in a very particular way. Of course, those pictures derive from Welsh emigration to London. Poor people, all that, we know the background, But the fact of the matter is, these things were incredibly nasty, racist pieces of imagery. It's quite complicated with these, because the two sort of foundation images of Siôn ap Morgan and Winifred, as she's called, Winifred, which was the standard name for a Welsh woman in the period.
No, it's okay. Do not.
They're actually very beautiful things. No, so you have this, and if you don't read the text and you just look at these things, you think, wow, these are amazing, absolutely fantastic things, And of course, they're the art of the common people. They were sold for a penny or twopence on the street. Beautiful things, but they are really nasty, racist images.
Well, they are interesting. They're quite interesting today, because you got the goat features so strong as some kind of emblem of Welshness until about like the beginning of the 20th century. You see them inside of Eisteddfodic chairs. You see them as a sort of symbol of Welsh. You see it still with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, or in the army, the goat is still used. And of course, the goat is the animal of a poor landscape, isn't it? You don't have goats in East Anglia because the land is very good.
Well, in the early pictures, you see the mountain landscape as well, which is
of course.
Pointed mountain.
And then going with it is usually something the Welsh gentleman, because the Welsh can't say "ja" comes up. So it's Welsh gentleman, and then it's shown ap Morgan, ap Dafydd and stuff, because this is peculiar as well. And that can also be self-depreciating. The Welsh have these long pedigree, which means absolutely nothing to someone in London. All this going back. So it's
Sean, can I say there's an interesting thing about that? In that section of the exhibition, we've followed the evolution of that image.
Yeah.
And what's really fascinating from our point of view as people involved in political action is that bang on 1800, 1799, 1800, 1801, you suddenly get all these prints emerging from London when that negative image is ditched totally. And what suddenly becomes this elegant woman dressed in classical clothes, and she has her arm around a goat, which is like a lap dog, really nice now. And she's standing there looking very beautiful next to Scotland, who's also standing there in exactly the same form with symbols of Scotland, next to Ireland, standing there in exactly the same way, next to England. Well, what's going on here? Why this sudden change of imagery? Well, the answer is there's a war going on against Napoleonic France. And from the London perspective, what do we need? We need British unity.
Yes.
Okay. So the image changes like that. They're absolutely overtly and self-consciously political images. And you can see it change like that in 1799, 1800. There's a whole flush of these images from London. It's fascinating.
And of course, Ireland is united into the kingdom in 1801.
1801.
Which, from my little research, the book I published about the Welsh flag, where I found the first documented use of the Welsh standard flag, so in the modern West, dragon on a green mound, is from either 1801, I think it's like to 1807, and someone's mistaken the 7 for a 1 in handwriting by the Prince of Wales. So, and let's talk at the time of setting up something like the Order of St. David. So there's actually a petition by Welsh Gentry for having something similar to, I think in Scotland, they have the Order of the Thistle or something. So the Welsh in London, Welsh in Wales, Gentry, of course, are petitioning for a road of St. David, which is quite, these are very un-Welsh people and by Welsh nationalist standards, they're very patriotic and English, if you like. But this is turned down. But it is interesting that the Welsh standard, the Red Dragon, comes back into fashion because there's no trope of the Red Dragon for about 200 years before then. Just after the union with Ireland, I think, and people starting to think, oh, maybe we need to have some kind of recognition of Wales and Ireland, well, Scotland and Ireland, certainly. Wales is then sort of tagged on, I think, by the Welsh, trying to big themselves up to some extent.
You get a second flash of it in the early 20th century, leading up to the First World War. That's the second, when national confidence is growing again, because especially from Cardiff, because we've got huge wealth in Cardiff, just for that short, unique period. And what's fascinating is when the Great War comes along, same situation again, but coming from the inside this time, you've got this idea of the Welsh army fighting the battle of the Celt against the Teuton. And there's a whole flash of imagery like this idea that there's this independent Welsh army in some way. And you've got this, quite lots of people will have seen this book, Land of My Fathers, rather than Had I, which was produced thousands of copies of this book, which features Welsh art. And it actually starts with a statement about how this book is to support the Welsh troops fighting the cause of the Celt against the Teuton. It's the most extraordinary sort of convoluted.
Well, I mean, and the British Army does more to propagate the Welsh flag, the Red Dragon flag, during the First World War, with things like flag days.
Yeah, absolutely.
And big tourism than almost anything else. And then you got, ironically, things like the investiture in 1911. They used a version of the Welsh flag, usually with a more, actually, which the Welsh office in London has now started to reuse recently, where there's some kind of mound, the Red Dragon's on more of a mound type of thing. And so it's interesting how the British state co-opts. It's just different to the French state. So this is one problem the Bretons have, is the French state never actually tried to celebrate a Breton legion or a Breton brigade, as we've had to some extent, and then tried to co-opt that. They've been told to be French, basically. But it's interesting how the British state has tried to do that.
But I mean, I think it's important to understand the engagement of Welsh people, and especially the Welsh establishment in London, in all these activities. We can't say, oh, it's them, because we're participants in that. I mean, for instance, in 1911, you mentioned 1911, you get Christopher Williams's great painting Wales Awakening, huge.
Yeah, that's the one I was referring to, not Credit One, sorry.
Yes. By the way, the drawings for that are in the exhibition.
Yes, excellent.
So you've got and another picture which actually very near that in that part of the exhibition is an image which has become very celebrated, quite iconic really, which is Here I've Cymru am Hedd Wyn, the picture which celebrates, that's the wrong word, which memorializes the death of Hedd Wyn in 1917, the poet. And the black chair and all that, which becomes very popular because it's reproduced as a postcard and so on and so forth, which feeds into the idea that strain of our self-identity, which is to do with pacifism and all the rest of the Hedd Wyn statue in Trosfynydd. He's there after a big argument, by the way. He was there presented as a shepherd, which he was, rather than as a soldier. Which there was another group of Welsh people wanting to present him as a soldier, but in this case, the pacifist element won out. But I've paired the original painting we've got in there, but I've paired it with another image three images by the same painter, John Celt Edwards, which are absolutely jingoistic, British, anti-German, anti-Turkish, really nasty racist images. So, we've got to look at ourselves in this as well, and not say or point the finger, because we were complicit in the creation of a lot of this imagery.
I'd like to maybe move on, because the exhibition includes more modern art or art from a more contemporary period. So I find it quite interesting that from the mid-20th century, if I remember correctly, we start to get art to do with something which can't really be painted, or is tried to be done in any case, which is the language, which becomes a topic of discussion within Welsh art, and the threat to the language or celebration of the language. This is often done, obviously, by actually writing stuff in Welsh on a painting. But But I think that's quite interesting. So the art, so in the exhibition, you have things to do with obviously the Gentry, say, and a depiction of Welsh life, be that coal miners or disasters after coal mines. You have some tropey stuff of Welsh people going into London, and including pub signs, which is interesting, and how that's another form of art, and probably the most visual and used form of art in the 19th century for most people.
It's the visual culture of the common people on the street, and it goes with the ballads, the illustrated ballads, which was sold, and also free art, which we forget about. But there's a whole section of the exhibition about free art. Now we're all familiar with Salem. The reproduction of Salem, which was given away as an advertising thing. If you bought your £7 of Sunlight soap, you got a copy of the picture of Salem. Because it's become quite iconic, I'm slightly to blame for that, because I wrote an article years ago calling it the national icon, and that stuck. But I didn't realize at the time that actually it's part of a genre of advertising material, so that we've got a whole series of these things up there, which were freebies given away by shops to advertise their services, drapers' shops, grocers' shops, even in quite tiny places like this one from St. Granog, for instance, which are really, really nice prints of ministers, preachers. There's one with the three most popular poets of the mid-19th century, Talhaeon, Ceidog, and Mynyddoch. Lovely things. So Salem is actually part of a genre of free art as well. So along with the pub signs and everything, there was an active visual culture. And the point is, Sean, that we just don't see these kinds of pictures, these kinds of images in art exhibitions with a capital A. This is the whole bulk of the visual culture of Wales, which was just simply cancelled and ignored, and is in fact vibrant and very fascinating and lovely to look at.
Yeah, and maybe for listeners not familiar, so Salem is a painting which is very well known in Wales, of the old woman with Welsh hat and the shawl and everything in the chapel. So there's various takes on that, and you're meant to be able to see the devil in the outline of her shawl, which shows she's rather, she wasn't a good Christian, she was actually quite vain. So that's a very famous picture. So the ones to do maybe, well, if we say it's the mid-20th century onwards, coincidentally, from about the same time, people, in the establishment are told about there's no Welsh art. There's also maybe a reaction, you can tell me to this, if this actually happened, people maybe reaction to this, and actually is a Welsh art, and they do it in a very almost obviously Welsh way by including bits of Welsh written on the canvas, or to do with expressions of Welsh national identity. So how does that manifest itself?
Well, you can trace this. It's very interesting looking at the work of a very celebrated, still alive, Mary Lloyd-Jones, famous artist, lives just down the road from here, where I am in Aberystwyth now, still going in her 90s. But if you look at her work in this period we're talking about, she was a hard-edged abstract painter. Okay, and then you notice, and it's quite sudden, you suddenly get Mary changing stream, and Welsh words start to appear on her work. She loosens up, she becomes a landscape painter. She's looking at her own landscape, especially in Cwm Rheidol around Devil's Bridge, where her family were involved in weaving. The building is still there, the mill where her family worked, and she suddenly starts painting these what now very celebrated images from that area, and it coincides with the rise of language activism and new political awareness in the 70s and through the 80s. It's very striking, and of course at the same time you get a much younger generation of painters like Iwan Bala is the most famous one, of course, and still working. Ivor Davies comes back to Wales in 1974 and soon after forms this group of politicized Welsh painters, Ivor Davies, Paul Davies and Peter Davies. They get together and they form Becca. And of course the name is derived from the Rebecca rioters, as we have to call them in English. And they produce a self-consciously political art, and it parallels very closely the language movement and the national movement, the rise of the national movement applied in period.
Yes, and especially examples of that, and and it's not just the art, because Peter Davies, if I remember correctly, literally in the Eisteddfod field got bits of soil from the Eisteddfod to try make Paul Davies, make a relief of a map of Wales to show this is of the soil.
Well, in the very famous example is in the terrible Eisteddfod when it just rained for a whole week in Fishguard.
Yes,
And Paul got
I was
busy and
there.
created this huge mud map of Wales. But the important thing about his imagery and Becker's
Yeah,
imagery, you always find Wales detaching or detached from England.
right.
So the map of Wales becomes very important, but it's detached
Yeah,
from England. And of course, Paul's the most famous image of him is holding this huge railway
yeah,
sleeper above his head at the Eisteddfod in Wrexham in 1977 with WM, Welsh Not,
yeah.
above his head as a protest against the Arts Council, who'd imported a whole load of artists from London to teach us about.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, he's standing outside.
Oh, interesting.
Oh yeah, he's
I'm
standing
familiar
out.
with the picture. I didn't know the background.
Yeah, but what you probably haven't seen is the man who's shouting at him, a painter
Yeah,
called Mario Merz, who was an Italian-based painter, worked from London, who'd been
yeah.
imported by the curator of that exhibition, a woman called Carolyn Tisdale, who was a very well-known English art historian and critic, and by the way, my tutor at university, which was not good news,
Yeah.
because we didn't like each other even then, I can tell you.
Right, okay.
But he'd been invited by the Arts Council to bring down these artists from London to show us how it was done, to
Oh,
show
right, okay.
the common people of Wales, the natives, and that's
Yeah,
usually part of the linguistics of this as well,
yeah.
the natives, what real art was. And Paul stood up there outside and created this actual event. And of course, they got terribly upset. They didn't like this because they were because Paul was actually doing the stuff, outside, but they didn't like it.
Well,
And
that's interesting because I mean, in a way, the art establishment there is almost 100 years later than the sort of written establishment where the nationalist effort, so people know, during the 19th century, until quite late in the 19th century, was getting people to submit stuff in English.
yeah.
Because the idea was to improve the education of the common people,
Yeah.
and stuff was submitted in English and then judged and could be won. But that's also phased out towards the end of the 19th century, if I'm correct, and then there's a Welsh only rule comes in. Obviously,
Well, it
visual
didn't.
art, because it's not by language, can be different. So I'm surprised that that kind of Victorian
Oh,
Welshness
yeah.
filtered on until mid 1970s. That's very interesting.
Yeah, well, I
Uh,
mean, the Arts Council is really complicit in all this. And I mean,
yes,
you mentioned the Aesthetics of Relevance, which I wrote.
yeah,
Well, that was the outcome initially of it was a development of a paper I wrote called Cultural Policy,
right,
which I wrote for the Arts Council when I was briefly, I have to say, briefly a member of the Art Committee of the Arts Council. And Cultural Policy critiqued many aspects of the art funding policy of the Arts Council in the mid 1980s. And in my innocence at that time, I thought it was an objective, thoughtful look at the Arts Council. And I mean, the roof fell in. I mean,
yeah,
it was awful. I mean, the abuse I had and the furious reaction against this paper, which dared to critique certain aspects, including included elements to do with the language. Because despite what you say, in fact, the language is very important in terms of Welsh visual culture as well, because of writing art history, of writing art criticism, of the interpretation in galleries of exhibitions and so on. I'll give you an example. I got into terrible trouble because the Glynvivian Art Gallery at that time in Swansea in the
yeah,
80s stubbornly refused to use the Welsh language at all on any
yeah,
captions or anything like that.
yeah,
And I, in a meeting in Swansea, I dared to mention this, and the result of that was I ultimately got chucked off out of the Art Council because it was not considered appropriate that I, as an art committee member, should critique one of their clients for not using the language. And I just
yeah,
proposed in cultural policy that no the Arts Council should not grant fund any gallery which refused to adopt a bilingual policy.
yeah,
But I had to say that, and it created a huge reaction. In fact, one art committee member wrote to the director of the art committee of the Arts Council and said of cultural policy, Peter Lord has spent 40 pages doing nothing more than plug the Welsh language.
which
Yeah.
is a bad thing apparently. Yes. So
Yeah, well, right, but that's how it was then. It was
yes,
really
and
good.
I think there was an attitude, maybe there still is to some extent, that if it's art, it's a way, it's an escape from the Welsh. Those dastardly Welshies insisted on doing stuff in Welsh. Look, it's a picture. There's no need for Welsh in here,
Yeah,
of
yeah.
course. And I think it's been a refuge for some people in the artistic community in that respect. I'd just like to maybe just finish. We're talking about the use of Welshness in terms of self-consciously with the Becca group. There's also a use of Welsh landscape, which has become motifs of Welshness. So maybe the most well-known, or among the most well-known, would maybe be Cyffin Williams, who wasn't a sort of Welsh nationalist as far as I know. But his pictures have become some kind of a badge of Welshness for people. So does the exhibition deal with that as well? So, the people are maybe celebrating the Welsh landscape and seeing that as some kind of expression of Welshness as well.
Well, you could say that in one sense it deals with it because there's only one landscape by Cyffin Williams in the exhibition, which doesn't reflect his status, of course,
No.
in the minds, especially of I would say one of the ironies about Cyffin is, of course, that disproportionately his patrons were Welsh speakers.
Yeah.
And Cyffin comes from a Gentry background, and the idea is, of course, he spoke in a terribly posh voice like this when he spoke in English. He wasn't like that at all, actually, and he did speak Welsh, actually. He was a delightful man, but he had a very complex attitude, and one of the reasons for that is interesting in that, of course, until 1974, he was in London, and his first patrons were this same group of people that created the No Welsh Art mythology. And in fact, the very first painting we've got in the exhibition is Cyffin's portrait of Wyn Griffith, the man who wrote Welsh Art thing. So he was rather heavily influenced by that group of people. And when he came back in 1974, one of the first things I noticed that he was persistently being quoted in the media. He had very good access to the media from early on. He was constantly quoted as complaining about the lack of patronage in Wales. And it was really bizarre because when I started to do my research, I'd go into people's houses looking at pictures or whatever, and every house had at least one Cyffin in it. And I was thinking, what's going on about? And of course, Cyffin ended up as a millionaire on the basis of this Welsh patronage, which he said didn't exist. So these things are very complicated, but I wouldn't want to down Cyffin at all. He was very kind to me personally. And by the way, in the campaigns against the National Museum, complaints about the failure of the National Museum to support Welsh visual culture properly, back in the late 70s and the 80s, Cyffin was there, and he was making statements about that as well. So Cyffin gets a bit of a bad press. About his
but it's interesting because you have another artist, David Griffiths, if I remember correctly, who's painted many portraits of establishment people in Wales, which is important because we need to recognise our leaders as well. And I remember he and I think Cyffin were asking for some kind of Welsh portrait gallery, partly to recognise their work, of course. But I mean, that's an important facet. I mean, we still don't have a Welsh portrait gallery or even a Welsh National Gallery, though the museum is meant to be one.
Well, we don't have one. No, we don't, because let's get this straight. I mean, National Museum's art department is not the same as a national gallery. And the reason is, well, it's a historical process, but the reason is twofold. One is that it has wider responsibilities than that, in that it sees itself, rightly or wrongly, as an international art gallery, the same as the National Gallery or the Tate Gallery in London or the Getty or whoever. It sees a responsibility to doing that. And the second reason is that it is consistently, from the 1950s on, appointed a series of English-trained curators who simply were not interested and did not see it as part of their responsibility to create a narrative history of Welsh visual culture. They didn't know anything about Wales. I mean, they really didn't. They were remarkable, and I knew some of them. I'm not just saying that. The last one, Timothy Stevens, eventually we were able to get rid of him, but I mean, his attitude was absolutely appalling to the culture he was meant to serve. So that
that's something. I mean, if people are thinking, political parties listening to this and talking about writing manifestos, this is something which needs to be sought out.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting because there's a parallel here with the campaign for things like devolving the Crown Estate, where, ironically, Peter Lord, the very people who tell us Wales are too poor to be independent are exactly the very people who are against Wales having control over its vast mineral wealth. In the same way, the very people telling us there is no Welsh art are the very people who create structures which makes it more difficult to promote and to patronize and to create Welsh art. And I think that's not a coincidence, is it?
It's full of irony, it's the whole situation.
Yes. I'd just like to wrap up, Peter Lord. If people may be able to notice from your accent, you're from Devon originally, so you made an absolutely huge contribution to Welsh life and Welsh cultural life in the last 40 years, maybe even
50,
more.
50.
I think you're being grossly underestimated and underappreciated, both as an artist, as a curator and historian as well. And I think the reason for that is you don't put up with a lot of the bullshit other people can. But I hope by now we're starting to see that basically what you've been saying for the last 30, 40 years is actually true and has a lot of relevance in it. Maybe just before we wrap up, because we are Welsh, we are interested in stuff like this. What is your background? How do you get into all this mess, Peter Lord? Why?
You know, I was looking at some photographs that I used to be when I was 14, 15 years old, I used to make model railways, very interested in that.
All right.
And I was looking at some photographs of a model railway that I made. It was in the attic at my house in Exeter, where I grew up. And there's a sort of model village and a cottage, and behind the cottage is a stone wall. And I painted on the stone wall 3 whales.
Oh,
yeah,
it's interesting.
I was about 15. I'd been on holiday a couple of times to Mid Wales, to this area, and I've obviously picked that up. And I would also say, looking back on that the first political party that I voted for, the first election in which I voted for the Wessex Independence Party.
All right.
So
didn't know there was such a thing.
You didn't know there was such a thing, did you? But I mean, it is significant, I think, because the things that I did when I was at school, I did 3 subjects to A level, right? I did economic history, and I say that economic history, not political history, economic history, politics, and art. Those are my 3 subjects. And really, nothing changes, does it? You know, that's where I am still.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an absolute disgrace they didn't use your art when we had the new assembly, the new Senedd. So they should have had something rather than just rubbish. We've had just some kind of pieces of glass.
Yes, well, it wasn't.
And that lollipop in the center of the Senate chamber, which absolutely is chosen because it's national. That's why it's chosen.
Well, listen, I have to tell you, because you brought it up, all right. David L, when they were talking about the building, he was in charge of, took it upon himself to be in charge of art policy. And I was invited onto the committee, and I proposed all sorts of, I thought, interesting things. I think I lasted 2 meetings on the committee, and then I was out the way. And I must say, I never got on with David Ellis Thomas. I found him very, very difficult and very narrow-minded in his attitude in many ways. Very difficult man, and I think you know, very damaging in some ways because of his attitude to Welsh history, Welsh historiography. So you know, that was a difficult relationship, and that was an example of it. I was on that committee, but I only lasted 2 meetings, and then he made it clear. He actually said, "We're having no historic Welsh art here at all. It's got to be new art," and so on.
Yeah, well, which is an absolute nonsense, like saying, you know, white people don't have a colour to their skin.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, absolutely.
Which is a nuisance, and it's created a Senedd, which I think is just boring. You know, it's meant to be apolitical and national, because deep down that doesn't offend the British establishment.
Absolutely.
And you know, that would never happen in Westminster, where it's full of references to art and statues and everything, and it's all there to promote the glory. It's a cathedral to Britishness.
Some of it made by Welsh artists. For instance, the wonderful statue of Queen Victoria as you go into the House of Lords, fantastic thing, beautiful. That was made by John Gibson, born in poverty in Conwy in 1790, and by 1865 the greatest sculptor in the world, and another Welsh artist who's not had any recognition at all, but you know, incredibly important and now largely forgotten. But there, as part of that, perhaps one of the most dramatic pieces of imperial symbolism in the whole of Westminster is that particular sculpture, and it's made by this Welsh artist.
Yes, but the Welsh have internalized this. We're not good at art, and also, you know, we don't want to show off, which absolutely. I think is an excuse for being cowards and not celebrating our own culture. Peter Lord, I mean, so there's exhibitions at the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth. It's on until 6th of September. It's really worth going up. It's a big exhibition, loads of stuff to see. It's an accessible exhibition, so there's all kinds of different art there. So if you don't like pictures of 18th century gentry, and I don't, that isn't the only type of picture. So
you surprise me, Sean.
Yeah, I just can't abide them. They all look the same. So it's great stuff. And I say there's paintings of pub signs, cartoons, paintings by, I just say the coal miners are very moving because they're actually men of that soil, and they've actually suffered. There's political stuff, there's landscape stuff as well. I'm sure, Peter, you'd be up to giving guided tours, maybe of Parthian, Yes Cymru group, maybe, or whoever. Get in touch with the National Library, I suppose, is the best thing to do. Peter Lord, thanks for that. Thanks also for all the work you've done for Welsh art and Welsh nationality over the decades. There's many books written by Peter on history of Welsh art. We'll link some of them in the bio with this podcast. So until the next time, I'm sure you won't be quiet. You never will be. I'm sure you still keep fighting and finding new stuff, which is interesting from Welsh art, kept in people's attics. Speak to your grandparents. Maybe they've got a nice, interesting picture from 19th century, which we need to get hold of. Peter, diolch yn fawr I ti. Thanks again for your time and for talking to me on the Radio Yes Cymru podcast.
Radio Yes Cymru.